I'll start us off by welcoming everyone to our third and final parish pairing. It's wonderful to see you all on this beautiful Sunday afternoon. Today's conversation is between our incoming director, Kelly Taxter, and Sheree Hovsepian, an artist whose work is going to be featured in the upcoming Affinities for Abstraction show, which we will open on May 2nd. We're not quite sure how we're going to open it, but we're going to open it on May 2nd at the museum. Happy to say that the galleries have reopened. The museum is bustling with the students exhibition, which is always a highlight of the winter season. But today's conversation will talk about Sheree's work, work that's in Affinities for Abstraction. Affinities for Abstraction is an exhibition that covers women abstract painters on the East End from 1950 to 2020. So we go all the way back to the core group of abstract women painters: Lee Krasner, Grace Hartigan, Joan Mitchell, Helen Frankenthaler, and Elaine de Kooning, Mrs. de Kooning. Starting with that core group of abstract painters and looking at how their work and subsequent abstract women artists have influenced each other. So it's not a chronological show necessarily. It's all about affinities. So we're very much looking forward to that. I think Alicia's put together an incredible body of work for us to look at. So I am delighted to welcome Kelly as our new director. She officially starts tomorrow, although I know she's been thinking about this since we first interviewed her. We're very excited to have her join us and take the helm at the parish. It's gonna be a whole new chapter in the history of the museum. And the museum has a long history. We're coming up on its 125th anniversary. So it's a very, very exciting time. And I'm very happy to have you all here. So we'll turn it over to Sheree and Kelly, who will talk for a while about Sheree's work, and then we'll open the floor back up to everyone. And I'm particularly interested in hearing the canine questions for the artists. Thank you. Alicia, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think you described the exhibition in a terrific way. I look at it as a chance to, I will say it might be somewhat idiosyncratic, possibly the long view of the through line of the extraordinary group of women who have painted here over the years, as I like to say, for a weekend, a season, or an entire lifetime. It's quite a cavalcade, very hard to even narrow it down to 45 artists, and I'm really going for an exhibition that's a delight to look at. I hope there are a lot of discoveries in the show, perhaps some names you don't know from the standard histories, and I really look forward to. I've operated a little under the radar here. I think people are just sort of hearing about their being in the show and who's in the show. It's not meant to be exclusionary in any way. It's meant to tell a wonderful and exciting narrative. So I look forward to seeing it all up on the wall. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Kelly and Sheree, would you like to?
Sure. I just want to change my view here. Okay. So maybe it goes without saying, but if everyone can mute themselves until we get, until the question and answer segment of our program, that would be great. I'm Kelly Taxter. I'm starting as the director of the parish tomorrow, as Mary mentioned. So I'm really excited, and I just want to say thank you to everyone at the parish for organizing these events. They've been very cool, and I'm glad to see so many people logged on for it. So thanks to all of you for joining us. And I'm really pleased to speak with my friend and great artist, Sheree Hovsepian. I'll just give you the brief bio. Sheree earned her MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 2002. And she has a dual BFA and BA from the University of Toledo in 1999. And she studied at the Glasgow School of Art in Scotland in 1998. Her work highlights the physicality of the photograph and photography's relationship to the human body. Coaxed into sculptural forms, layered with tactile materials, and assembled into larger compositions, Hovsepian's pictures oscillate between object and image, creating a sensuous bodily experience of the photographic document, which I want to get to. I love that description of the photographic document as opposed to a photograph. Some recent solo and two-person exhibitions include the Tang Teaching Museum at Skidmore, Never Done, 100 Years of Women in Politics and Beyond, 2020 to 2021. Halsey Mckay Gallery in East Hampton in 2020, Higher Pictures Gallery in New York in 2019, and Team Bungalow in LA in 2019. So without further ado, I think we can just sort of get into it, unless Sheree, you want to start off by saying anything in particular. But I thought we could talk about first just the two works that are included in the exhibition.
Thank you, Kelly. Yes, I just wanted to just briefly say thank you to you and to Mary Frank and to Alicia Longwell for including me in this show. I'm really honored to be showing alongside these women who have really paved the way for so much visual language, and it's going to be great to see everyone in the same room, I think. And really I love the idea too about affinities, because I'll keep this brief, but I've often said that sometimes I felt like when I was growing up, it was hard to find artists that I could sort of model a career after, or to see people with children, working with families, and how they navigated working in the art world. It was such a male dominated field, and I think it's really important to have these sorts of exhibitions that give visibility to women, and I'm very proud to be included.
Yeah, well stated. I think there's shockingly still so many gaps in the canon, missing links and stories. So
Agreed.
that's certainly the role that these kinds of exhibitions play. Maybe I could ask you a more pointed question. I think it's always nice for me and hopefully for others as a way into the work to really just talk about, and we can start with these two that are in the show, but really just talk about process, if you don't mind, and really just kind of how you make these pieces, or what kind of sparks the idea to get from beginning to end.
Absolutely. So the first three slides represent the two pieces. The one in the middle is actually a detail from the first piece. But what you're actually looking at are photographs of the human form and photograms, which are images printed on light sensitive paper, so on photographic paper, but they don't use a negative. So what I do is actually block out the light in the dark room on the piece of paper and expose certain areas and block certain areas out, so that you're just getting abstract forms. You're just seeing like black and white in these cases. And I'm doing that with using a blade and construction paper, sort of quickly like cutting, making like a gesture and cutting, and then using that sort of stencil to place over light sensitive paper, exposing that paper, and then putting it through the chemical process. And then I'm putting those pieces together with the human form. And then in these pieces, they are wrapped with nylon. It's a type of fabric that you would see in hosiery or in, lingerie, clothing like that. And I'm using the kind of the tension of the nylon to hold the prints physically onto the back surface. And there's a few reasons for using the nylon. One is that for me, it really mimics what's happening in the darkroom when I'm making the photograms. The way that the photograms work, the longer you expose the paper to light, the more black it gets. So this like kind of, you can kind of overlap and put two exposing it longer would make it darker. So this sort of overlapping of the fabric mimics that sort of the light layers overlapping to me.
Mhm.
And
But when
they
you're
also,
putting when you're doing the photogram part, so you don't ever walk into the darkroom with pre-cut shapes. You're doing both at the same time. Like you're actually making the shapes in the moment in the dark. So there's like a drawing component, which is,
exactly.
yeah.
It very much has to do with drawing for me. That sort of temporal, like physical, leaving the body to the hand, sort of gesture. So yeah. And then, so I guess I started, the slideshow that I put together was kind of a trajectory of my work that I think kind of puts, I guess kind of gets you to the point where everything like kind of makes sense in the present. But this is a piece it's about 12 years ago. It's from a series called Sleight of Hand. What you're looking at is actually my studio, but with 3 sheets of paper on the wall. They're all 3 sheets of black paper. However, I've taken the exposure of this, I've made the exposure of this photograph divided by 3. So after each third, I would go and remove 1 sheet of paper in the sort of from the top, then the middle, and then the bottom. So again, that idea of like layering, the more exposure, the darker it gets. These are on film, I should say, in a film camera. So there are multiple exposures recorded on a single piece of film, which to me, like this piece talks about a lot about photography, about the idea of like the decisive moment, as Cartier-Bresson had described, and how this is actually stretching that moment apart and deconstructing it. And also playing with the notion that photography is truthful, because what you see here actually does not exist in real life. It's and it's a figment of the imagination. It's, as a drawing would be, like it's giving you some clues, but then you fill in the rest. What's going on. The next slide is the same process, but with using color film and taking 1 sheet of paper and moving it after each third of the exposure. So the floor, the wall, and the darkest colors of this shape receive the full exposure, and everything else that you see is just a fragment of the exposure. If that makes
Can
sense.
you back up a little bit and talk, because since these are like over a decade old, and then we just looked at something that's quite recent, which, there's some of the same elements, but in these, the idea of a subject, like a human subject, is gone, and you're really playing with the basic elements of the medium, right? So can you talk a little bit about where you were, like why this particular mode as opposed to, a more traditional, I mean, this is actually quite traditional, because you're playing with the formal elements of the tools at hand, and there's like a reflexive study of photography itself. And
for me, also, it's also a recording of a performance in a way. So there is like a physical aspect for me, going in and actually like moving what goes on outside of the realm of the picture plane. So for me, it's very physical, and again, ties into what I'm doing in the dark room with the photograms. I also see that as sort of recording a performance within a certain amount of time and space. So, and putting it in the studio was also a conscious decision about sort of location, about, a constant place of experiment, a place that I embody. But but here you just see the trace. So these are photograms that I started making after that series. And again, the same process I described earlier, going into the dark room, using pieces of construction paper, a blade, slicing them, putting them together. I did sort of some forms that I thought related to abstraction, and one was a grid. And then I started making pieces that were starting to become more physical, kind of on accident, but then I, went with it, and I started making these heads that were appearing.
And this is still all using the same process, like this
These are all
photo.
Yeah, so here you can see more like the ability to use, to use shading and variants of gray.
And they're not collage, these are flat.
These are flat.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're on a single piece of silver gelatin paper. They started getting bigger. This piece is maybe 30 by 50, something like that, but that's bigger, so more physical. This idea of the performance in the darkroom is more, present. And then I was also working on, I started doing different bodies of work. This is an early collage where I also try to do other things when how can I put this? I like to also experiment with other materials. And what's happening in the darkroom is often like a very quick process. And so I like to spend time in my studio doing things that actually, take up more time, or, I taught myself how to macrame and was using macrameing things and objects and using those into these sort of constructions that I would put together, collaging, found elements, made things. This one is a collection of, there's a photograph, there's the piece in the back, which is also a photograph, but it's a composite digital print. There's a bronze sculpture, and then a mask, African mask, a found African mask that I've macrameed. And then, so I'll often just kind of go into these different forms of making and then put these things together into a collage element. This piece is one that I started using. It was one of the first ones I used fabric for, the nylon. For me, so what you're looking at is a photograph of my sister. So my sister is my model. She is the person that I use for all of the images and has been for many years. That's for the reason is one that I have access to her and have had, forever, and she also is physically very similar to me. So she performs as sort of a stand-in in a way. So in this piece, you're looking at, a photograph of her, which is in a frame that's kind of meant to point to the objectness of the photograph. And then a piece of string that's in a shape of a triangle on the wall. And then there's a plate of ceramic, which has my fingerprints going through it. It's we're just kind of scratched through. And then that piece of nylon, which is stretched. And for me, there's a real visual resonance between the fingerprints, the wrinkles of the nylon, and then the hair for hair. I should have put a detail in here. It's a little unclear, but that was kind of what was working in it for me. And then you can go on now to the next. And then I started using the nylon in a different way. I was tasked with trying to think about my work in the context of drawing for a residency I was doing at the Drawing Center. And for me, it became this idea of giving the viewer, something, a little bit of something, and then allowing the viewer to kind of fill in the blanks. When you make a drawing, it's an illusion. You're relying on the viewer to fill in the blanks of what it is. And so I was kind of, thinking about it in that same way, that sort of temporal, a way that reacted to the body in a way. And this was just to show that sometimes my work sort of feeds itself. So after I did that work, I was thinking about putting the body in that same meshed material. And if you could go back one, I just wanted to show. So for this, the areas where, the fabric is overlapping, then the paper, what you're looking at, let me just describe what you're looking at first, is a large photogram that had been a kind of one that I never used. It was rolled up and sitting in my studio. And I was just trying to put things together with what I had, which is often the way I like to work, kind of in a very scavenger sort of way. And I revisit often, my works that don't, make it to finish, and I never throw photographs away. I use them for collages if I don't find, purpose for them immediately. So this was a large photogram that had this pearl, and I, pinned it to the wall and then stretched the fabric over it. And then the areas like where the paper was coming up and pushing against the surface of the nylon were really kind of like talked about like what I was trying to get at. So you can go on now. And then I wanted to kind of, that made me think about like doing, a series of photographs with the figure in this type of fabric as well. To kind of,
it's like before I was thinking about this talk, I never thought about this with your work before, but I really started thinking of Senga Ngundi. Mm-hmm. But like specifically that series where, where the performative, where she would have the performer with the RSVP works, and it's all, you have the woman and she's pulling all these different pieces. And I mean, is that a reference for you or at all? Or, I mean, it never, I don't know why, because it's so funny. When I think of nylon, I think of two artists all the time that are completely different. One is Sarah Lucas and one is Senga Ngundi. I mean, they're from completely different paths, right? But it's such a provocative material because it's something that I don't know if it's because I'm a woman or something, but I instantly understand it in some way. It's very feminine. It's like very feminist also. Anyway, it just occurred to me like yesterday morning, and I don't know why I didn't ever before, but
I learned about Senga Ngundi. Right now she's having such a, everybody knows her name now, and you could pick out her work everywhere. But I'd say 8 years ago or so, when I, was making that work, or when it was like starting, or when I was playing with the nylon in the beginning, she wasn't that prominent. So, but then afterwards I started seeing her work, and I love her work so much. And I'm super happy to be like put into a sentence with her.
It's just this nylon. There's something about it that's just.
Well, it talks about the flat. Yeah. I mean, it talks about the body. It's like, it's something that signifies the body, and often the feminine body.
And like also the like skin, like it's also like has a racial charge, I feel, because it just the way that it's manufactured for all the, it's always been this like, you're like pale white to dark brown, even the way it's packaged, and he's like sometimes in those little eggs, it's just so bizarre. Right. The bizarre material. It's provocative. It's like it's material, but
true. So these are I'm beginning to make these pieces now, putting them in frames based on that original piece that I taped to the wall, or I'm sorry, pinned to the wall. But now, I wanted to like frame them and make them, objects, and using kind of, cast off old photograms that I had. And also in this piece, the kind of grayish paper that you see underneath that tone is actually it's unprocessed photographic paper. So it's still sensitive to light, which is really interesting to me. Like this idea of the photo, the piece, the artwork being sensitive. And if there's a lot of light shown on it, it will change colors. So.
Will it get darker or fade?
It gets darker, but then it will lighten again. It's not fixed. So it's just still moving, it still fluctuates. And then I started shooting and shooting my sister specifically for these works. And so then you'll start to see actual body, in mixed with the nylon and the photograms.
And these are artist frames too. So there's a significant depth to them, which is interesting. Like you're really creating a space and a box and a frame and can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, they're frames made of walnut wood. I really wanted them to highlight the objectness of the photograph and like of the piece. And often I'll use curls and things will come off of the surface in that way. So they become shadow boxes and kind of house these collages.
There's always there's a consistency to the way that the nylon sort of frames in the shape of this oval slit or kind of eye shape that.
Again, a photographic thing. It's like this idea of like looking in this, aperture.
Like a shutter, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, and it's just the way that the nylon moves. It's just kind of inherent to the fabric.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Well, there's an interesting tension. I mean, there's a couple of different dialogues that are present. One is obviously between, the abstract and the figure, or abstraction and figuration. But, there's, for me, particularly as a woman, and I think with women in photography, there's just this idea of power is just implicit. And I don't know if you want to speak on that at all, but what I'm also curious about is the difference between you behind the camera and you in the darkroom. You've taken on these two modes of making a picture, which is like taking someone's image, but also having this private space. So that's an interesting collision.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's even more interesting. It's funny. I did in grad school, I did a whole series of work. I mean, I was never a picture maker. I was never someone who went out in the world and took photographs. I was someone who used the camera as a catalyst to do other things. In grad school, I was doing a series where I was documenting my photo shoots with people with video. And so it was like this idea of talking, it was about looking at the power dynamic between the artist and the model, and sort of subverting it, or, playing around with that, sort of investigating that and what goes on outside of the picture plane. With my sister, I mean, that's another reason why I think I photograph her. We're very close in age. We're just a year apart. We have sort of an inch. It's really the only time she listens to me, quite honestly. I can't telling her what to do. It's, there is a persona that has to happen. And then, and it's much more stringent and, decisive than what is happening in the dark room. In the dark room, I feel like there's a lot of play. There's a lot of, a lot more uncertainty than what I sort of, command as someone behind the lens.
But
so these are some.
Sorry, go ahead.
So these are some of the, again, like I'll sort of reach into something that when I make a body, sometimes of work, sometimes it instigates or triggers something else that I want to make. And so these photographs are for me kind of indexical images of what, the nylon pieces are, what's happening with those. So how she's interacting with these shapes and sort of, hiding behind in the studio again.
And are you setting her up to be in this pose, or is there like a more free form thing going on and then it's a stop? Or, I mean, what's the, if you're able to divulge?
Yeah, I mean, we shoot a lot more than what you see. So there's a lot of editing involved, but basically, yeah, I had these large pieces that I had cut out, and, I would have her play around with them and sort of, have her move in certain ways. I think she doesn't love doing this, I have to say. Like, it's not fun. So, but it's definitely, she's very gracious. And then these are coming towards like a more recent mode of working for me. They are still assemblages, but they're much smaller in scale. And I'm using ceramics, string. String has like it's loaded with meaning for me. It's something that reminds me of time I spent at home with my mom, like, she was told to do some string art when she was had a breakdown or something when I was very young, and the doctor told her that she should take up string art. And so
what did that mean to the doctor? What did string art mean?
So in the 70s, I don't know if you remember like those ships that people would make with the string, you'd wrap it around the wires and make different patterns. It was kind of big in the 70s. But it's, yeah, I'll find some.
Like a kind of mind clearing, like a meditation kind of practice?
Yes,
the idea?
And it is very meditative. It's very meditative. It's tentative to me. Also, if I make a design that I'm not happy with, it can, I could undo it very easily. But there is something very meditative and even just the feeling of it, even like the other things I talked about, like doing macrame and things like that, sitting and having something that's accomplished to show for the amount of time that you've, worked on something. Satisfying in a way, I guess.
These are even more box-like, right? Because you have these like heavier, like the ceramic itself has a depth, and then you have the pins and the strings, so they're really becoming like Cornell.
Joseph Cornell, it was a big influence on me. I mean, I went to school at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, and they have one of the largest Cornell collections. And I would just go into that room and I was always obsessed with kind of the amount, like how they just talked about devotion in a way, and about like obsession. The size was just, something I was always really interested in. And some of, and early collaging.
Well, and everything within that box becomes so charged.
Exactly.
It takes on these other qualities, which you start to read the body against the shape of the ceramic and the relation, you've created a charged atmosphere by that. And that's like that, the white thing is a ceramic piece wrapped with string. Is that what we're seeing?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then over COVID, I started making these wrapped forms where it just seemed it just seemed like it made sense. These kind of like wrapped, encased pieces.
So these are brand new from this year.
They're starting from, I think many of these are from a show that I had at Halsey Mckay Gallery in August, sometime this summer. Yeah. And this one is currently I have a 3-person show at Rachel Uffner Gallery in the Lower East Side. If anybody's there, go check it out. I think it's pretty killer. Yeah. So, and it's up until April 3rd. So if you're in the city, please go see it. So here's one that you can see like the actual depth. Yeah, I love that, they become objects. And I've seen also too, some people actually will display them as sculptures, like on a credenza or something like that, instead of hanging, which I think is pretty cool too.
Yeah, there's that one almost looks like a musical instrument.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's funny because you've kind of pushed against every distance that photography facilitates. Some people use the camera as a way to create this kind of space between them and the other, or, it's this way. I mean, I think of Warhol, and the camera always being on his person, right? And that everything was photographed, everything was just kind of at this remove. And it was this way of looking and a way of presenting and like showing, these mirrors of desire, which was like everything that he saw. And you're imbuing what you do with photography as a kind of base with so much tactility and hapticness and materiality, and even just, different forms of marking time. I think of clay and the different iterations that material goes through as a kind of time machine in a way. And it's also, a mark making device where you can have the hand or an incision, and there's just so much resist in a way, like this kind of counter to what maybe photography is more traditionally used for. Right? I keep using the word tradition, which is weird, but this kind of thing reminds me of like Wallace Berman. Even it's really different way of using the medium. And yeah, is that tactility or that need to really use your hands with something that maybe isn't as hand-based? Like, can you talk about that a little? And then we should let
Yeah, I
other
think you
people ask
describe the
questions.
tension that's like always going through me. I mean, I do rely on the indexical nature of photography is like almost a trope, like I think in these, but you know, and there's also, you know, I'm asking for a sort of symbolic understanding as well. Like there's a, you know, a tension between what is seen and what is understood about what you're looking at. So, and also in regards to ceramic, I started working in ceramic because often I'll think about things as how they relate to photography. For ceramics, to me, it was something that took it, you know, that where you could record an image, record like an image, it goes through a chemical process, and then there's also a threat of failure. So for me, in those ways, it was similar to photography, just the recording of like, you know, my fingerprints and marks, and that's kind of what I was doing in the beginning. But yes, there is like this kind of this need, this like draw for me to work with my hands as well as, you know, using the camera. Like there is a very like sort of physical like draw for me to make things with my hands.
Mm.
How are you doing on?
Well, we're just at about the minute to open it up to questions. So, I mean, I think part of the beauty of this program is having you available for all those that have joined us. So I'm perfectly happy letting some people chime in here, if that makes sense. How should we field questions here? Do people just want to start speaking? Alicia, do you want to?
Yeah, I will just say
Okay.
something if I may. Thank you both. This was terrific, really. Sheree, you know, when I first saw your work and then had a closer view this summer at Halsey Mckay, which was wonderful, I couldn't help but think of it. Maybe it was the Chicago vibration in the air, but of Moholy-Nagy and that whole body of work, which seems to me nothing about your work is derivative of his work, but it just made such a strong synergy between that. And then subsequently at the museum, we had a wonderful film about his work. Do you want to? And something else that occurred to me when you were talking about being sort of a scavenger in the studio and reusing photograms and in other, you know, cutting or perhaps slicing and using them. You know, Lee Krasner took old paintings and spliced them up and then reworked them into new canvases too, which I found interesting. Do you have any comments about Moholy?
I mean, I looked at his work extensively when I was doing the photograms, and I mean, it was, I just, you know, just that I looked at a lot of it. And of course, like when one looks at a photogram, you have to sort of think about Moholy-Nagy.
Yeah,
and also the paintings too, which I really was interested in.
And I know
but
go ahead.
I had something to say and I think it just like left me, but it will come back. Oh, about scavenging. To me, it also, I love hearing that. And to me, it's a very like sort of feminine thing. Like I kept thinking about like during COVID in the beginning when it was really bad and we didn't even know where to get groceries, like, you know, just being in the kitchen and trying to just like put something together. It's like a very like feminine thing to do, like kind of just go and make it work, like find what you need to do. And it felt very sort of like primitive to me. In the same way that I feel like in the dark room of like having to just, you know, make it work, make do with what you have.
Interesting. Thank you. Thrilled to have your work in the show.
Thank you. Him too.
Any other comments, questions? Just hands. I can't see everyone on both screens. So
We have a question in the chat.
okay.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Go forth.
No, you're muted, Joel.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm fascinated by this because my work is about as different from yours, Sheree, as it could possibly be. And yet we have a lot of stuff in common. The first one is what I would call truth to materials. I mean, you don't add color. The color of the nylon, the color of the wood, the color of the paper. And I do the same thing. I'll use color as long as it's the color of the metal and nothing else. And the second thing is the scavenger. I also do that, not really knowing what I'm going to do often until I do it, and picking up stuff and sticking it together, and it's like a journey every time. So I'm fascinated with your work. I think the collage pieces with the sculpture in front were particularly interesting to me. So I would say thanks so much for showing it to us.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. And yes, in color, it's true. I think I'm someone who likes to work with within confines or have limitations. It helps me work, and color is just not one that I've been able to broach yet. It's perhaps in the future, but for now, I'm still. The palette is something that's just it's pretty stringent, but it's also a lot of it is due to the type of paper I like to print on. I like to print on Ilford warm tone paper and black and white prints, and that's just it kind of dictates like the what I'm going to be putting with it.
Maybe you don't need color. I've done without it for 50 years, and I'm as happy as can be.
Sheree, hi. Love your work. It's Levon.
Thank you. Hi,
And
Levon.
I'm sewing. While I was doing this,
Look at you.
I had my camera off because, I think it is an inherently female thing. And it's interesting that you mentioned about COVID using the string. I mean, I felt so, again, scavenging. I felt constricted. I felt that we had to use what we have. This buckle came off a pair of shoes. So now I'm sewing it onto a belt, that kind of thing. So I'm completely on your page with that. However, when it comes to nylon, I like to wear nylons, but yet, because I'm from the Midwest, I'm from a farm in Iowa, we wore nylons, you can't have your legs showing. But like when you come to the East Coast, it's like a super feminine no-no. So talk to me about that. Is there a contradiction in that for you, or is it just, it's feminine? I mean, like, do you,
I would say my mom wore nylons. So I remember, seeing
Great. I'm old enough to be your mom. Ouch.
Well, no, but that's just what it's still in my history and my sort of idea of what is, feminine and female. And yeah, and I just really like how it looks like when it's stretched, when it's pushed to the furthest that you can push it. And which is also an interesting thing too, when you're working with it, it's like you're really making it work. You're stretching it so that it becomes sheer underneath it. Like it's doing something. It's holding the images down. You're making it work for you. So the material it's pretty fascinating, I think.
Just interesting. I mean, to hear the juxtaposition.
Yeah. Maybe we should bring them back.
Oh, no. Andy Phillips had put a question up on chat.
Can you hear me?
Hi, Andy. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Zoom is still a mystery to me. Thank you for sharing your work. I know you, but I knew a little bit about your work. It was so nice to hear your ideas and your processes and the nylon and the constriction. Very, very interesting. I just had a quick question, but I forgot it, but I wrote it. Oh, do you have any interest in experimenting with video or motion?
Yeah, a lot. I've made a few videos. so far they often look like moving photographs, but yes, I'm very interested in video. I thought a lot about working in video recently, and something's brewing, but it's not yet, but yes.
To be continued.
To be continued. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Sheree, I had a question. Thank you for sharing your work. It's really beautiful, and I love the way you marry shape and movement. I'm curious about in your photography about the absence of the face. You show different parts of the body, but you never show the face. So I was wondering if there's a particular reason for that.
I think in the nylon works, it's about abstracting the body, making shapes with the body.
But even in the photography of the body, I never see the face.
Yeah, again, it's like this idea of like hiding, sort of like being it might have like more of a personal reference, like this idea of like being somewhere but not fully being somewhere. Like, as I said, I want them to be sort of stand-ins for me. So I think like there are illusions that are sort of physically similar to me. Like sometimes my sister's hair will be in it, but I don't want them to be named as people, but rather have attributes that can kind of to give the viewer like some bits, but not to give everything, so that they can sort of fill in the blanks, or so it can also maybe speak about different people or speak about different things.
Yeah, I'm hungry too.
Thank you.
I have a question about scale.
Mhm.
How do you decide, since your work is the source of your work it comes from the human body, how do you decide how to scale it down? Because obviously these are works that are essentially domestic scale, not figurative scale. So how do you come to a size? How do you know it's the right size?
Some of those things are just made with restrictions of the way the paper is sold. The standard photographic sizes that I'm using to print, and then dark rooms often will have constraints, but I've been like, in the past year, I have really been feeling more about that things that I wanted to make things smaller, because I wanted to give the viewer an option, to come in and look closer, to come, investigate the inside. And I wanted them, it just felt more comfortable to me to make things more manageable in that way, in regards to scale. I feel like sometimes, making something small is a way of, imbuing it with a certain amount of power, because people have to come up much closer to investigate.
Thank you. It's interesting. Alicia, it's going to be interesting in the Affinities show to see how the artists work through scale, because I know you've got, obviously the original women worked on a huge scale, because that was part of abstract expressionism, but you're going to have smaller works too. That'll be an interesting path to follow. You're muted.
There will be some huge contemporary paintings. I mean,
Yeah. Well, no, that's the interest. It's how does this? It's a path. Where does it take us?
I think it's so particular to artists. I looked at an artist's work recently. It couldn't have been over 5 by 5, and I said, well, would you be happy with one painting in a show? I mean, so many other larger. She said, yes, I think it's, as Sheree was saying, is the scale. It is what it is in that sense, and the scale that you feel it should be. One of the last times I saw you was in the galleries, and you were at the museum galleries, and you were looking at the Louise Nevelson work, which is on view there, and thinking also of I'm very interested about the use of the boxes and the depth now of the images. You commented on Cornell, but I think you were interested in the Nevelson as well from that aspect.
Yes, actually, I grew up in Toledo, Ohio, and the museum there, we had a beautiful Nevelson. And I remember when I was in art school, I went I did my undergrad there, and the art school was actually connected to the museum in this Frank Gehry building that was connected to a very neoclassical style building, which was the museum. And I used to go there all the time and just like look at the Nevelson and think about how what this meant, that this was art, like how it informed so much of my sensibility of what art is, being able to look at that piece and really like study it over the length of my studies. So I feel a very strong affinity with Louise Nevelson.
It's interesting. And we have a very interesting wood collage, and so it's a flat work. It's not in the box, but has many tropes with your work. So maybe in some proximity.
I'm a fan of her collage as well.
Yeah.
I've seen, yeah.
So, questions. This is, this is thrilling to be able to just bombard you with all these things that really talking to an artist in this sort of intimacy. I mean, it really is a studio visit, and you're able to bring that to us. What a treat.
So does anyone know on 10th Street where the cluster of the 10th Street studios were?
Yeah, they were somewhere around University Place and in that area, as far as I know, and some Broadway.
Moving into a studio on 10th Street, which I thought was very interesting. I'm very excited to be there. East Village.
Mm-hmm. Just to the east. Yeah.
I'm just moving aside.
Any closing thoughts, Kelly?
I mean, the only question that I didn't ask you, and maybe it's worth asking at the end here is, I mean, you were born in Iran and you moved to Ohio when you were 4?
Less, I was 2.
2.
Well, Minneapolis and then Ohio. Yeah. Midwest, basically.
Right. And I'm just going to guess that there weren't a lot of other Iranian kids around.
There were not.
And I suppose I just wonder if you want to speak a little bit about, how identity has played into your practice, if it's on your mind, if it's something you're consciously working with, unconsciously, if you kind of looking back at bodies of work, if you see how it comes out, or in any way, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, I do think so. I think this idea of like having to constantly like locate myself within the studio to give myself to mark my physicality, mark my movements. I think also perhaps some of the remaining, keeping things faceless and making them just like sort of symbols and signals of, of the body, I think comes from some of that. I think this idea of like, seeing through different ways of looking, having like a multiple level of consciousness, I guess. And yeah, really the idea of of locating myself within a certain amount of time and space, recording, this, a movement or a gesture.
And the dark room being kind of that place where you're making some kind of mark.
Yeah.
Or is
I
the
mean-
studio and the darkroom, are they interchangeable for you? Is the darkroom a more like interior zone, or are they?
Oh, that's so
piece?
interesting, Kelly. I wonder. It feels like they feel very similar. I mean, in the darkroom, I do feel like it's probably perhaps a bit more freeing. It's more forgiving. Things happen quicker, like in faster repetition. So there's also less at stake. So there's room to make mistakes. I mean, and there's like been so much like about like the sort of womb-like nature of like a dark room, or one can think of so many illusions and about things being born out of like a dark room space.
It's so funny because my experience with photography, which was fairly limited. I mean, I made film, but I always was so nervous in there, like that there was some kind of like time limit and I had to get it right and I was going to screw it up. And then in the studio, I was a much more chill person. Like that's where, and you're describing the exact opposite, which is fascinating.
Well, the frenzy that you're talking about is actually like how I would produce so much stuff. I would go in and make these photograms, and there is a frenzy of like trying to get it right, doing it over. And then, but then at the end I would have so much, to go through. So.
Let's take this one more question from Paul, who asked, I wonder if there is a deliberate reason that these works seem to create, reveal an absence of nature. An absence of nature.
How are we defining nature, I guess? Do we mean like?
Well, I mean that because the other thing that accentuates it is also your use of geometric shapes, which we know don't even exist in the natural world. For example, they're man-made concepts that keep man's brain sort of like moving and ordered. And whereas when you look at nature, it's calming because none of these like pure geometric forms exist. So I'm wondering if there's a tie to the fact that.
Interesting. I think that it's actually maybe a sort of a putting together of the two. Like I think that there is the nature, but then there's also the geometric forms that sort of calm the chaos in a way. I'm often like thinking about like the idea of, reduction, getting to like the most, the essence of like what, I guess, like what is happening, and also using an economy of visual clues to sort of get to that place. I never thought of them of not, because many of the forms that I'm photographing, many of the objects I'm photographing are remnants of nature, like seashells and plants and, and the body. But the geometric is like, maybe, I see it as like being kind of like this ordered form, but it's also the way that the string moves around the pins. It's making making curves is not really an option.
Right.
But there are curves in the, when I'm making the sculptural forms, like there are curves. I'm cutting curves, like using a blade and kind of, using.
Well, thank you, Sheree, so much for speaking with us and being so open and generous with your time and your thoughts. In your studio, which I see behind you. And I can say from all of us at the parish, we're very grateful. And if there's no other questions, I'll just say thanks to everyone who joined us tonight and supported the parish. And I'm very excited to get there tomorrow and see more of you in the future, preferably in real life, but this will do just fine for now. And I don't know, Mary or Mark or Alicia, do you have any closing remarks?
Kelly, I think you just said it all, which is just fine with me. Welcome. We're so happy that you're with us. You know, we in the process of hiring you, we talked a lot about shows you've curated, and we've gotten the sense that you had a great relationship with artists, but actually seeing that manifest itself today has been really, really exciting and portends very well for the future. I think everybody will join me in agreeing with that. So thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Sheree,
Thank
for
you.
your
Pleasure,
time
everybody.
and
Thank you, everyone. And
See
thank you
you
for
all
the
at the show.
fascinating. Thank you.
Wonderful.
thank you for the great questions. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Sheree.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you. Bye, everybody. Have a great night.